Thank you everyone for coming to our online forum today, The Voice of British Survivors of Human Trafficking. It was a real honour to co-create this event with Emily and Karen, who are both survivors, both extraordinary anti-slavery campaigners in their own right. So it's us about the lack of British survivors and the lack of British survivor voices in our sector. While huge strides are needed to address this, they've finally helped us organise today's great agenda and discussion. And there are huge hurdles, as we know, for British survivors recognised, whether they've been exploited sexually by a group of men, suffered criminal exploitation at the hands of a drug organised crime gang, or suffered labour exploitation by a family on a farm. Everyone knew these sorts of things were happening. It just used to not be seen as a crime or was seen as consensual. It was just not anyone's problem. I mean, as we know, British victims are now finally recognised as the main victim group in the NRM, even though we fear these figures are just the tip of the iceberg. But we know the systems that we have are set up for these cases. So we know victims are getting criminalised, survivors are not getting compensation, and even if they are able to enter the NRM, the outreach support is sometimes so limited and short term, it isn't really there at all. Sad indictment of this was we actually hoped to have Jean Simister speak today. Jean was awarded the Human Trafficking Foundation Annual Slavery Day Trustees Award a few years ago. She's the mother to Daryl, who was trafficked for 13 years in labour exploitation. She's had to do all the heavy lifting to support her son, to safeguard him, house him, protect him from being re-trafficked. This huge task is partly why she isn't able to speak today. And it shouldn't be on families to do this safeguarding work. There's so little out there to help those vulnerable to exploitation, so no wonder so many risk falling back into exploitation at this moment in time. Is it a question of are we doing enough, or rather are we doing the right things to start with? Just to note that sadly Nicola Bell, our speakers, who's from the Thames Valley Partnership, is very unwell and can no longer make it today. I really wish her well and hope she gets better. Similarly, Damon Johnson, the new head of Mon Slavery Unit, can't make today because of childcare issues, but someone else from the Home Office is here to take questions back. I'll just pass over to Phil to explain how the questions are going to work.
Good morning, everyone. As you know, I always struggle with anything of importance I'm given, but hopefully this will work. I've done this a number of times now. So here where I'm pointing, if you wave your cursor over the screen, you'll see three little dots. If you drop that down or you hover over my picture, you can send me questions directly. I will log all the questions, and when we have the opportunity, I will ask those on your behalf. If they are slightly complex and we're able to, then I may ask you to ask the question as well. Sometimes they can be quite specific and in depth, and it might be that I actually get a bit of the wrong end of the stick. So just to try and avoid that, I may ask you to ask the question as well. But hopefully that will work. If you've got my email address, it's phil@humantraffickingfoundation.org. If you want to send questions that way, then I'll keep an eye on my emails as well. But I think that's it, Tamara.
Great, thank you. Just to know, this is being recorded and we will be sharing the video next week on our website. Also, just for speakers to keep an eye on me. Obviously, we have a bit of spare time because of a couple of cancellations. But if time does become an issue, I will then start using these. So if speakers can just keep an eye if things start to go on. And with that, I'm really delighted to welcome our first speaker. In a sense, she needs no introduction for our sector, Sarah Champion. She's one of the MPs who's been leading work to tackle sexual abuse and human trafficking of British children. And we're really, really delighted that she's able to speak today. Thank you. Sarah.
Thank you ever so much. My name is Sarah Champion. I've been very proud to be the Member of Parliament for Rotherham for the last 8 years now. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I became involved in slavery and why I have a particular interest in supporting British survivors, and particularly British children. So today is just the perfect opportunity for me, and I don't know about all of you, but I'm really looking forward to listening to the other speakers because we've got a great lineup today. So basically, I would love you to know about Rotherham because of the great art scene that we've got, the great businesses that we have, but unfortunately it's probably because of child sexual exploitation. I first became aware of this very shortly after being elected and discovered the true scale of it in 2014, which as someone who had done a lot of work on CSE at that point, I did a big report with Bernardo's. I really thought that I knew about CSE and that I knew about the scale of it in my town, and I had no idea just how horrendous, endemic and insidious the whole thing was. And to be quite honest, I've been trying to unpick that ever since. We're very fortunate because we have the National Crime Agency doing the biggest single investigation that they have ever done. We have secured a number of convictions. Sadly, or maybe not, they have now identified and are supporting just over 1,500 victims. And we are looking at least 300 perpetrators at the moment, but we still have years to go before we find all of the victims and survivors, get them the justice and get them the support that we need. From finding out about CSE, I then became frustrated that the trafficking laws hadn't been used at that point. As you'll be aware, trafficking is actually quite a simple thing to prosecute. It's moving a child from one location to the other. And it was rarely used. And when I started looking across the country, it was rarely used across the country, partly because I don't think that the children were ever seen as victims of modern slavery. And so the association was never put together. That is changing now, I'm very pleased to say. But also it led me to look into our society's attitude towards prostitution, because a lot of the children in my town were viewed as prostitutes rather than as people who were being sexually exploited. By putting the term prostitute on them, it was seen that they were consenting to their abuse. And I then started meeting people who were also labelled as prostitutes. And I'm sure you're aware the main driver for international women to be trafficked into this country is for the sex industry. And I'm yet to meet a woman who I can say has given informed consent to the situation that they're in. And so I've become an abolitionist when it comes to prostitution, because I'm afraid unless we stop the demand, which is the buyers, I can't see that prostitution, that slavery for women and that child sexual exploitation is ever going to end. British victims of modern day slavery, as you know, have been overlooked for years. And it's a puzzle to me, because while after the Palermo Protocol, we did start to recognise children, for example, children from Romania, as victims of modern day slavery, we still miss the enormous scale of sexual, labour and criminal abuse of British children and vulnerable British adults that are here right now, being trafficked, being exploited. And still, I don't think as a country we've grasped that. Teachers, social workers, police, and indeed politicians have let them down and continue to let them down. And whilst I'll keep on fighting in Parliament, it's a real uphill battle. Because we brought in the legislation, I think that Parliament thinks that everything's a done deal, and it doesn't look into the details of how that's being applied and the resources that need to be in place to make it work. I think we also need to remember the very recent history of how we viewed victims and survivors. So in the 2013 report Shadow City, which is one of the very first reports to highlight the issue of British girls and boys being trafficked, it reminds us just how backward our views were. So let me give you an example from the report. I quote, "The defence barrier for the Oxford gang of perpetrators of child sexual abuse suggested to the jury that girls were simply pretending to have been raped or trafficked for sex, and were actually just naughty girls regretting doing grown-up things." Another quote, "One 15-year-old girl died following a possible deliberate drugs overdose. In a letter she had written when she was 13 about her drug abuse, she revealed how she tragically blamed herself for her abuse. I've slept with people older than me. Half of them I don't even know their names. I'm a slag, and it's nothing to be proud of." For some reason, we have been much more and are much more judgmental on British victims than those from abroad, who we can romanticise as a so-called perfect victim that of course doesn't exist. Assumption around what a victim is, what a victim looks like, how a victim presents, still perpetuate. And I'm very concerned and keep on raising that rarely includes boys, that rarely includes people from the BAME community, and almost never includes victims with disabilities. British victims are still facing challenges, and we need to accept that to be able to address it. And I would like to focus a little bit on boys. I was one of the core participants of the ICSA inquiry into exploitation of children by gangs. And what struck me most was most boy victims are discovered when they are within the criminal justice system, usually when they're in prison. That's how they're being identified, because they're not being seen as victims and survivors. They're being seen as naughty children who deserve punishment. And we have to fundamentally challenge this and turn it around. But let's be frank, our system doesn't know what to do with or even how to protect children from the gangs that are looking to exploit them. And so the first resort is to imprison them. I've got to say that that's the case in Rotherham. I know my council and the police force have completely turned themselves around since 2014. But a couple of years in, I asked them, the council, how many referrals they'd made to the National Referral Mechanism, and they hadn't made any. and I was saying, but you know that there's lots of girls who are being trafficked because of child sexual exploitation. Oh yeah, but they're British girls. The National Referral Mechanism is for international girls. We have to get over this. We have to challenge this. And the other thing that really sticks with me is I went to, in South Yorkshire, but not in Rotherham, a secure children's unit, which was basically a high security prison. And I was very, very struck that there were boys and girls living in the same space. The boys were showing a lot of aggression, as you can understand, and the girls almost always had been victims of sexual exploitation. How is this the right environment to put those children in? What support are they getting? And how is it that we seem to think that this is the logical place to put them? And then I'll not start, because of time, on unregulated children's homes, children's accommodation, which, to be quite honest, once you're over 16, tends to be a bed and breakfast. To say that that is part of the care system when no care is provided is simply shocking, and again is something that I'm trying to overturn, and I congratulate the Children's Commissioner for the work that she's done on this. So, to try and be a bit more positive, we are seeing more and more British cases in the National Referral Mechanism data. So things are starting to go in the right direction, but we all know that that data is just the tip of what is really going on in the country, and most victims and survivors remain hidden. And the ones who are referred, are they being adequately supported by the system? And I've got to say, from my experience, no, they're not. Very few of the perpetrators end up in court, let alone get prosecuted successfully. Very few victims ever receive adequate compensation, let alone the psychological support that they need. There are so many hoops to jump through to even manage to get a positive, reasonable grounds decision from the NMR, alongside getting access to long-term support, adequate safeguarding, getting wrong criminal convictions, because that's the other thing we do. We're very swift at criminalising the children, trying to get those dropped, trying to access the education that maybe you've either been denied or just weren't in a fit state to access. You have got to be a genius to adequately get the support and the justice that you need in this system at the moment. And also, we know that many victims are targeted, particularly because they have mental, physical disabilities, and that is exploited. And we don't recognise that, and we really need to. So for me, the solution is always very clear in these situations. We listen to, we believe, and we act on what the survivors tell us. They're the experts in this. They're the people that can tell us how to improve our policies, how to improve our systems, and how to prevent this crime going on, which is why I'm so honoured to be here today in an event that I know survivors have been core in developing. Thank you all very much.
Great, thank you so much. That was really, really powerful. Really, really appreciate some of the things you said are shocking to me, like the fact that the NRM is still not being used in these places where these issues have been going on and so well publicised. So thank you very much. And our next speaker is, again, needs no bill introduction in our sector, Sarah Thornton, the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner. Really delighted to have you speaking today.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me. And as Sarah's just said, thank you for putting on this event to discuss this really important issue. And I too am really looking forward to the debate and the discussion. What I thought I might do, just to set it off, is talk about three things. First of all, about the data about identification and what we know is going on. And secondly, I'll then talk about support for adults, and then I'll talk about support for children. So I'm going to cover those three areas. In terms of the numbers of referrals, they are increasing. When I was looking at the figures for 2019, the referrals of British nationals were 2,836, which was 26% of all referrals. Most of them children, but amongst those 450 adults. For 2020, we've only got the first 3 quarters data at the moment, 2,571 referrals, which was 34% were British nationals. So as a percentage of the whole, it has increased quite substantially. I'm assuming that Q4 will be no different. So it is in one respect, it's good that people are being identified, but actually it just illustrates the extent of the problem. And of those first 3 quarters in 2020, 2,140 children referred. So it is a substantial issue. And I guess the first thing I wanted to talk about is it just raises the issue about whether the national referral mechanism is the best way to deal with all these UK nationals. I understand completely the point that Sarah's making, that actually if it's there, for goodness sake, use it. And that's what I would argue. But I think it begins to ask really important questions about, is it the best way to support British children and adults? So in terms of talking about adults, I was going to focus on 3 key areas. What we have found, and I know the Salvation Army have found this, and I think Anne-Marie will be speaking shortly, is that a lot of UK nationals have a number of complex needs and vulnerabilities, including mental health issues and substance misuse addictions. And I noted in the Salvation Army's latest report, it talked about many of the people coming to us for help have increasingly complex needs, as many will face problems with mental health, addictions, learning disabilities, and severe physical health issues. And I think that whole issue about the complexity of people's needs brings to our attention the fact that actually the Care Act doesn't deal with adult victims very well. As we know, there can be real challenges to applying the Care Act. And although modern slavery is a list of the kind of categories of abuses, I know, having spoken to many people in the sector, that actually making the need is really quite a difficult debate. And one of the things that I've also discovered is, as well as that, you have this difficult handoff between what is the local authority's responsibility and what is the Salvation Army's responsibility in terms of the victim care contract. And we know that whenever you have those sort of silos between in organisations, cases, real people can drop through the difficulties and through the gaps. And I've raised this on a number of occasions, and often the response is, well, we eventually sort it out. But actually, eventually can take a long time, and there can be a lot of harm over that time. And I was looking at the statutory guidance, which talks very much about the victim care contract generally offering temporary support. Other long-term support options should be pursued where they're available and able to meet the victim's needs. And I understand the logic of that, but actually the harm that can be caused is you end up, as I say, with this sort of difficulty about, is it the victim care contract responsibility, or is it actually somebody's got a pre-existing need that needs to, for which there are alternative forms of support. So that's the first thing in terms of support for adults. There are problems with the application of the law, and I think sometimes gaps between the various organisations. The other area that has been a real issue for adult victims is accommodation. I have raised this on a number of occasions, and in fact, because I'd noticed that the domestic abuse bill had been amended to provide better provision for victims of domestic abuse, I wrote to ministers back in May saying, could the same priority need be extended to victims of modern slavery? And I'm afraid the answer was no, but ministers assured me at that point there was continuing conversation between Home Office and the Housing, Communities and Local Government Department. And that continues. There is the Homelessness Code of Guidance. We have made suggestions about, although again, a victim might have priority need, it's not absolutely explicit. And we think there should be lots more detail about the needs of victims of modern slavery in that guidance to really increase the potential, increase the likelihood that people will be properly supported. So I think that is a key area, and it's still not resolved. If anybody's got any practical ideas, I really want to listen to them, because I will raise them with ministers. We've also been looking at whether reciprocal arrangements between local authorities might work. And so, for example, with the London Leeds, we've been working with Tamara and with MOPAC to think about whether a reciprocal housing arrangement between boroughs could work in the same way that there is one for domestic abuse. And if you look at the Home Office evaluation of those local authority pilots they did a few years ago, we know that homelessness is a real issue. It is a real kind of vulnerability to re-trafficking. So what more can we do? Because it seems to me that there is a substantial gap there. And before I go on to children, the one other thing that's worth saying is, although the numbers of adults being referred into the NRM has increased, there are quite a few UK adults who are saying we don't want to be referred, and that's showing up in the figures for duty to notify. And I think it's also important, as well as thinking about the victim care contract, what are the non-NRM pathways available for victims, and think about different ways that we can support people. And I know some of the work that the new victim navigators are doing and the new victim support pathway coordinators, those sorts of roles seems to me to be good practice to find different ways to support people when they need it. So some big issues about support of adults. In terms of children, as I said, in fact, of all the British referrals, children make up a substantial percentage. And Sarah has referenced some of the practical difficulties that exist in terms of children. It's one of the things that I became very aware of last year. We were doing some work on the statutory defence, which is available for those who commit offences as a direct result of their trafficking. And it struck me a couple of things when we were doing the call for evidence and the workshops, is that sometimes there can be a view that if a child is referred into the NRM, then the local authority doesn't have any responsibility. Of course, that is absolutely not the case. The child always remains responsibility of the local authority. We have asked the Home Secretary to make that clear to local authorities. We were also concerned that the guidance working together doesn't really deal with child criminal exploitation and extrafamilial harm as well as it needs to. And I know that that guidance is being rewritten, but it's something that we have been pushing for to make sure that it actually begins to cover extrafamilial harm as well as it covers intrafamilial harm. And the third thing that we found in that work is that absolutely, as Sarah was saying, when you have a victim who is involved in child criminal exploitation or child sexual exploitation, that absolutely should be an NRM referral, but that also should be Section 47 inquiries, that this should be triggering substantial child protection activities locally. And we're not at all convinced that happens all the time. So kind of a range of issues about children, and absolutely agree that the thinking, the practice, the interventions to support children when the threat is from outside the home, when the threat is from criminal gangs, is something that is so immature compared with a lot of other thinking about child exploitation. We really do need to do everything we can to encourage that so that there is much better support for children and they are protected from the criminal gangs. The one other thing that I might just mention before I finish on that is some of you will be aware that I think it's 18 police forces now have violence reduction units. And we've been looking at the work that they're doing to prevent vulnerability to violence, but particularly from the trafficking and exploitation angle. And many of them are covering that. And I think that is another kind of way into this. So what more can government be doing in terms of guidance? What more can local authorities be doing? But also what more can police and crime commissioners and police forces be doing to really think about what does primary prevention look like? What does secondary prevention look like? What does tertiary prevention look like? So we can really protect our children in particular from this sort of criminal exploitation. I'm going to stop there because I'm really interested in what people have to say, and in particular to listen to the survivors who are with us today. Thanks a lot, Tamara.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. So yeah, our next speaker is one of the people who helped us organise this event. Karen, she's not just a survivor, she's a leading anti-slavery activist. She's also the first British survivor to sit on the Minister's Victim Support Group, and we're really delighted to have her speaking now today.
Hi, thanks, Tamara. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge victims that are trafficked into UK. Exploitation doesn't discriminate. It's totally inclusive. We shouldn't discriminate, and everybody needs to be treated fairly and equally. So it's important we remember them as well, given the current situation. Also, I've taken the decision to do this live on camera. I haven't waived my right to anonymity. A lot of you know who I am anyway. So I'd appreciate if my image wasn't shared. But I've taken that decision because it's really important that you see that I'm an ATT number, but you could be sat here right where I am now. Because the only reason I was exploited and you weren't is because you didn't come into contact with my perpetrator as a child. And if you had, somebody would have disrupted those activities. I wasn't plied with drugs. There was no alcohol involved. It was purely through violence that I was exploited. That violence was as bad as it gets. There were firearms. I was abducted. I was held captive. It's all in there. I eventually ended up in intensive care in hospital, and I wasn't expected to live. It was so bad that on the 6th day in hospital, I'd spent 6 days completely on my own. Nobody knew where I was. I was a child. The paramedic that had taken me into hospital, because she thought I was going to die, refused to leave my side. She sat there holding my hand. On the 6th day, I was transferred to a different hospital. And when I regained consciousness, I was lying in bed, still wearing the clothes that I'd been admitted to hospital in, covered in sick, covered in blood, and the stench was horrific. Because I'd had a catheter fitted the whole time, nobody had taken it upon themselves to tell me where the wash facilities or the toilet facilities were, and I was too embarrassed to ask anybody, so I lay there on my own like that for days. Because I was sexually exploited and I was taken around the country and sold like a piece of meat. On top of all that, I was also criminalised. And I ended up with approximately 20 pages of criminal record. And I paid the equivalent as a child. In today's monetary terms, it would be about £2,000. And I didn't come from a dysfunctional family. My parents weren't alcoholics or drug addicts. In fact, my mum was a postgraduate. That during the time I was being exploited, my parents had 2 properties. And I don't mean council house properties. We're talking a cottage and townhouse. And so I take a lot of offence when we get labelled as being, you know, delinquent children, and we have learning disabilities, we have mental health issues. And that's actually quite offensive when we start picking apart the victim and what makes us vulnerable to being exploited. Because if it can happen to me, it can happen to you, it can happen to anybody. Because my parents couldn't be blamed and etc., all eyes turned on to me. So when I escaped my abuse, the only thing I could do was take full responsibility for being a criminal. And that meant I went through my adult life taking the blame for anything that went wrong, to the point where I couldn't assume I'd be automatically invited to family weddings. I couldn't be trusted to be in someone's house on my own. And, you know, it's important to point out, I actually have never committed any crime of any sort, ever. How I ended up being criminalised as a child, Professor Susan Edwards actually produced a report, and this report is a word-for-word account of exactly what happened. I mean, the fact that she'd produced that is just unbelievable, and it showed that everybody knew exactly what was going on. So if anyone wants to understand how I ended up as a child standing in court, being labelled a prostitute, being fined as a child who cannot get a job to pay those fines, you should read Susan's report. Tamara has a copy of it if anybody wants to access that later. So I went through life as an adult trying to hide from everybody, being this misfit, being blamed for everything, and carrying the burden of what I'd put everybody else through. And then I heard the words, "There's no such thing as a child prostitute." And I was like, excuse me. And that hit me in the face like a brick, basically. And I then realised that my entire adult life had been narrated by everybody else and by everybody else's failings. And I was left sitting, well, if I'm not a criminal, who am I? And I started questioning, you know, it had affected my employment. I'd been trapped in poverty throughout my entire life. I'd battled all these barriers that, you know, someone that's been criminalised faces for no reason whatsoever. And I was absolutely furious. So I was left questioning everything from family relationships and friendships. And I was like, well, if I'm fake, does that mean my relationships, my friendships are and it completely fries your head. So I had to find out what happened, what had gone on, how come I was in this position. And through that, I discovered the NRM. And I thought, oh, this is brilliant. So here we have this support package that's going to provide me with the support to be able to address all these issues that I now have. Because it's the journey of recovery is also a journey of discovery. Because when you've been exploited, you've been completely brainwashed. And if you'd asked me at the time of my abuse, what was my favourite food, I would have turned to my abuser and asked him what was my favourite food. You completely lose your identity. So the only way to move forward is by regaining your autonomy. And I thought the NRM would provide me the support to be able to do that. And specifically, what was really important was my convictions, because I had roughly 40 convictions, a 6-page DBS. And I thought it would look into that and we'd be able to get that wiped and cleared and addressed, but that wasn't the case. The criminalisation was never, ever addressed through my support. I was wrongly told that because I wasn't seeking asylum, I wasn't entitled to legal aid. Because I wasn't entitled to legal aid, I therefore wasn't entitled to any legal advice. I was told I wasn't entitled to compensation because there was no criminal investigation going on. And I didn't even know that subsistence existed until I reached the point of the RNA. So then when I was in the RNA, I was now self-funding my own support, and I discovered subsistence, and suddenly everybody was entitled to subsistence, but I'm in the RNA, and the RNA is needs-based. So my support worker is saying to the SCA, we need all this, you know, all this stuff. We need X, Y, and Z. And the SCA are turning around and saying, no, you don't need it. And my caseworker is saying, well, but we're having self-fund support here. And they're saying, no, you can claim it on benefits. And then I got a back payment, and the back payment was immediately to be returned. And the reason I was given was because my support worker had not requested subsistence when I initially went into the RNA stage. But the reason she hadn't requested subsistence is because she was told I wasn't entitled to it, and I wasn't entitled to it because I was British. And so it went on. And to add insult to injury, it would come back in the RNA that I should consider joining a gym or community groups and everything for emotional support. And I was like, excuse me? So now I'm self-funding and I'm supposed to pay for gym membership and tell everybody down the gym or down the, the local yoga club or whatever about my experience as a means to get emotional support. I'm like, are you kidding me? And it just went on and on and on. But before I went in the NRM, I had gone to the police and and they didn't identify me as a victim of trafficking. And when I joined the NRM and I said to them, they specifically asked me, what is the NRM? They didn't have a clue. So far, I've been fined for being raped. I've had to self-fund my own support, and I've been refused financial support, which I'm legally entitled to. And I've been refused the back payment of that support as well because of some mess up. And as if that isn't bad enough, I'm now on my 8th RNA. And that means over the course of the last year, I've had 6 or 7 exit dates during the pandemic. And what you don't realize is every time we submit an RNA, I have a session lost to filling out the form, going through the form, looking at what we need. And then another session is lost due to collating all the evidence for that RNA. And that means for every RNA submitted, that's 2 sessions lost. And those sessions could have been used to help me out because during my RNA period, we discovered that I'd been receiving the wrong benefits and I'd had to pay those benefits back. So I've lost 4 months of support from my caseworker due to completing RNAs. And to add insult to injury, when I received the back payment and was ordered to return it immediately, that very week, I was lying in bed with food poisoning. My benefits had been stopped. So my caseworker is saying to me, you have to return this money. And then in the next breath, she's saying, I'll go down to the food bank and get you a food parcel. And I had to be financially supported, as Tamara can confirm, by the Human Trafficking Fund through HTF. And it's just an absolute mess. So if I get exited from the NRM, the RNA, if I get exited now, none of my support needs have been met. So that leaves me thinking, well, what happens next? And the RNAs come back, we need to start looking for support from outside agencies. But there's no outside agencies where I live. I have to commute at least 50 miles for anything. And that means I'm left in a vulnerable position. And that means I'm then a commodity for other agencies to be exploited for funding because they cannot provide me the services that are supposed to be provided through the NRM, which is specifically what the NRM was supposed to do. So when I sit and think about, well, who am I? I then start wondering, well, am I just somebody that is to be exploited by, and treated as a commodity? Because if I'm not, I've gone through the time where I've been treated as a commodity by my traffickers, and now my autonomy is being taken away through the NRM support system, and here I am as somebody that has these needs, and these needs just haven't been met whatsoever. It is just shocking, really is shocking. And I just heard Sarah Thornton speaking there, and I want to point out, you know, victims do not all have drug issues. We don't have alcohol problems. We don't have learning disabilities. Before being exploited, my childhood was spent being dragged around bookshops looking for Ruskin books for my mum. You know, we're not all working class white girls. It's not about that at all. Anybody can be exploited, and that's really, really, really important. We keep picking apart victims and saying, what is this? I mean, have we got to a situation where we're accepting that trafficking and organised crime is going to exist? So instead of dealing with those that are committing the offence, we're picking apart the victims, and that has to stop. Something has seriously gone wrong. And these girls are being treated as girlfriends, and while they're being treated as girlfriends, they're being completely ignored. And the traffickers will have, say, 5 girls on the go, but so too do the boys that are victims of criminal exploitation. They also have multiple girls on the go as well. And each girl is being used for a different purpose. And these girls are not being identified. There's no safe spaces for them to go to be able to disclose exactly what's happening. And they've fallen through the net. And there's a real problem with the data because so many girls are just not being identified. We're now identifying the boys through county lines and criminal exploitation, but we're failing to pick up the girls. Thank you. I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Wow, I think you can see in the comments how amazing that was. Thank you so much, Karen. That was shocking and powerful. And I think what's so disturbing is the fact that not only was Karen completely victim blamed and let down and commodified as a child, but that unfortunately the system that we've got, the NRM, to support her has completely let her down to the point that she's essentially being re-traumatized, re-victim into a situation where she's had to apply for 8 RNAs, eight reapplications just to try and stay in the NRM rather than focusing on healing herself, which suggests that the system's really, really broken, I suppose. And so thank you, Karen, for that. Our next speaker is Space. Space is one of the most expert organizations out there. They provide training, they support families, and they focus solely on criminal exploitation and have huge expertise in that area. And we're really delighted that the founder of Space is able to speak today.
Morning, everybody. Before we start tomorrow, is it easier just to ask you to flip through the slides?
I'll just say, Katie, have you got the slides with you? Yeah, I'm sure we can. Wait.
Yeah, just give me.
Great.
I've got a feeling it probably won't work at my end. Thank you very much. Okay, so just a quick introduction, really. I'm not going to identify myself. We are an anonymous organisation for security and safety reasons. Whilst we campaign for British CCE victims and now adults as well, because a lot of those children are now adults, this group has a specific distinguishing features. Some of the wider points that we make apply equally to CSE victims as well as other UK modern slavery victims. I just want to explain really that when I use the word victim, it's in the modern slavery context. So next slide, please. Thank you. This is just a very quick overview of our background. We've got a law enforcement background of some 34 years, direct insight where systems have been self-tested and we're very familiar with. So we present both sides of the coin, lived and the professional. So we offer a unique vantage point into what's going on. And with all the families that have contacted Space since we went live in 2018, we've got a very wide view of the trends and patterns, failures and the best practice across the country. We train, we offer a consultancy service and also expert court witness service as well. I think it's probably easier now if I just go through some of the key points that we're actually seeing across the country. And a lot of this is from those who've lived it. So this is victims and their families. And I think with child criminal exploitation, it's fair to say it's one of the largest groups that's exposed to criminalisation within the modern slavery context as a result of the type of activity that they're exploited into. So what we're seeing is there's a real lack of authorities, and by authorities I'm talking about police, local authorities, schools, health, all of those agencies. There's a real lack of readiness or willingness to view victims as victims at all, let alone modern slavery victims. And much of this within county lines victims stems from behaviours and presentation that a lot of the young people are presenting with. So these are in the main due to their grooming, or the rewiring as I call it, because it is exactly that. There's a slight difference really in the grooming there with the boys, certainly. The criminal presentation, the hatred, which is really endemic within county lines, a hatred towards police, which is again mimicked taught behaviours, and the imperfect, non-stereotypical victim who doesn't want to be saved and therefore must be an offender. We're seeing primarily boys being identified, obviously through the NRM figures, which we know is tip of the iceberg, but also our own service, where parents are contacting us for assistance. So boys are severely challenged by the gender bias that's playing out, where there's a perception of choice, and boys will be boys. County lines victims are, as Sarah said, made to jump through unnecessary hoops, and the ones that we're seeing time and time again in almost every case, they're expected to self-declare as exploited in order to be referred into the NRM. So, you know, that's slightly problematic because county lines victims don't see themselves as exploited due to the grooming tactic, a very successful grooming tactic. They're expected to identify their perpetrators, their associates, or their traffickers as a condition of being put into the NRM. There is also an onus on them basically to do all the heavy lifting and the legwork, and you know, the expectation to raise a Section 45 defence in order to trigger action or referral. Nobody's really explaining to them, especially to the children, although this applies equally to adults, but it would be in different language. Nobody's explaining, actually, by going into the referral, you don't have to say a word about anybody, or you don't have to say, you know, a word about what anybody's doing to you. Any of those details that are going to render these victims, you know, in a really quite disastrous place if they were to share that information. We know from our cases that county lines victims are overwhelmingly favouring pleading guilty and going to prison rather than speak up, due to the rewiring that leads to a notion of loyalty, fake loyalty, and also threats. We're seeing almost no assessments relating to vulnerability or investigative work around traffickers or even victimless prosecutions, you know, not evident for several reasons, including a lack of resource, lack of expertise, and sadly also lack of will. A big challenge is that lack of pressure evidence of exploitation is being seen as an absence of exploitation perpetrated altogether. Victims' language, for example, in texts, which may appear consensual, but it isn't in reality, is being used as evidence to suggest that they are choosing to be offenders and far from victims. There's a lack of understanding of how rewiring, brainwashing, control, and coercion is playing out in those messages. There is no need for a ball and chain for these county lines victims, where consequences are understood silently between the exploiter and the exploited. These things are not going to be visible when police do telecoms work. Power, influence, and impact of grooming is not given due weight, yet it's hugely prevalent and relevant. A recruitment tactic and the silent driver that the victims are themselves oblivious to. Victims are sucked into county lines and kept in, either through grooming or coercion, threats, reprisals, and debt bondage. Grooming is preferable if you're an organised crime group, as it's more beneficial, triggering misplaced loyalty, as I said, to organised crime groups, which then results in no comment and the wall of silence. It's a lot less work to groom a child than to keep them in through pressure. Victims' inability or refusal to engage with the authorities, which is absolutely bread and butter standard, is interpreted as a non-genuine non-victim. Their non-verbal presentation is not considered, as the statutory guidance makes clear, should. There are huge gaps in professional knowledge relating to modern slavery, and the spirit and ethos of the NRM process completely ill understood. There is regular evidence that law enforcement routinely treat an NRM referral as an investigation as opposed to an assessment, highlighting a potential victim. This demonstrates the referral is weighted against a victim. Also, lots of evidence that the NRM exists, lots of evidence that law enforcement view the NRM as existing merely to record an individual, maybe a modern slavery victim, and nothing more. There are many involved in this area, specifically county lines, who've called for a move towards an assumption that all children exploited into county lines are exploited victims unless there is good, clear evidence to the contrary. Whilst this may result in a few offenders benefiting and abusing the system, the current national picture demonstrates that huge numbers of victims will be correctly identified and supported and not wrongly criminalised. Some forces have a policy of referring all children into the NRM, and whilst that's a good move, given the national position that we're seeing, what we're seeing is actually this is often a forced referral, in that the first responder does not actually believe that the child is a victim at all. As the referral is only triggered due to the blanket policy within the force, it's frequently a very poor referral, leading to detrimental outcomes for the victim and requiring re-referral with full reasons to demonstrate the exploitation at a later date by somebody else. Due to the nature of the county lines activity and the serious risk to life it poses to exploited children, the delay in recognition as a trafficked person are clearly a safeguarding concern, not to mention the imminent threat of criminalisation. So the time's running out. You're either going to be dead or you're going to be imprisoned as a young person. And actually the NRM is just being faffed around with and not being done for years in many cases. First responders have little to no training on the NRM process or its wider impact, and we're routinely seeing first responders not recognising clear signs of exploitation, hence not referring. We're seeing that they're unaware why a referral should even be made. We're seeing that they're unaware or unwilling, if viewing the victim as an offender, unaware of the ability to challenge a negative decision, whether it's reasonable grounds or conclusive, either through re-referral, submission of further information, or an appeal. We're seeing many first responders telling parents at the end of the road it's a no, when it just isn't the case. We're also seeing that they're unaware of the victim support that an NRM should be triggering if it's done properly at the appropriate stages, and therefore failure to advise victims of their entitlement. I can't even talk about examples of any sort of support packages which Karen has just spoken about, because I know of no cases where anything has happened beyond a decision being delivered, yes or no, because that's where the journey is ending for all of these county lines victims. There is nothing beyond the decision. We're also seeing that authorities are failing to give parents accurate information or advice about the process, thereby leaving them in a very confused at best state or misled position at worst about what they can and cannot expect, certainly in terms of statutory responses. Sorry, is that my slides moving along?
Sorry, I wasn't sure if you wanted them moved
No,
along.
I'll go
Okay,
through them at the just at the end, if that's all right.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So the entire modern slavery legislation, the system and the guidance was designed obviously to respond to overseas modern slavery victims for whom huge numbers of support NGO charities exist. However, these organisations remain, with the best will in the world, unable to appreciate or meet the very distinct needs of British victims. We're seeing a huge impact of British victims and families not receiving accurate information, and in essence they're a round hole in a square peg with a system in which they're no more than a bolt-on and an afterthought. Coming on to the issue of corporate parents, local authorities trumping British birth parents of counter lines victims. So parents are kept completely out of the modern slavery proceedings and processes. They are reliant on case positions which are frequently inaccurate. They're not advised of significant trafficking decisions relating to their child, normally a minor, or only verbally told with no written confirmation whatsoever. So we're seeing lots of parents asking police forces for the decision which we're prompting them to ask for, and the response is, well, we don't give it to you because the local authorities got it, because they're the corporate parent. So whilst it's right and proper that children's services act as corporate parent for unaccompanied minors from abroad with no family in the UK, this cannot be the case where there are birth parents present in a county lines case in the UK. Parents who are protective factors especially. In such cases, children's services involvement should be purely concerned with child protection, safeguarding and support of county lines victims, but not as a corporate parent. So just to give you a couple of quotes from some of our cases from police forces. One had told a parent, the NRM is only a counting exercise and there's no point or gain from it, so we won't be doing it. Another one said, the NRM has been created. However, at this time, it will be filed as person X is not engaging with the police. Another quote goes, this ultimately will require the cooperation of person X in order to evidence how he has been a victim of modern slavery. None of these things are first responders called to make. They cannot gatekeep the NRM and they cannot preempt a decision from the NRM. There is no requirement for a minor to even be made aware of their NRM referral. And in CCE cases, there are routinely many indicators of exploitation that can be identified and relied upon by first responders, and there is literally no requirement for victims to demonstrate or confirm their exploitation. So in other words, a child simply doesn't even have to speak about any of it in order to be referred. So the whole notion about engagement is irrelevant. Support for victims with reasonable grounds or conclusive decisions is simply non-existent for UK victims, as you've heard already. Only some of the support in existence for their overseas counterparts applies to them, but accessing this is an uphill struggle where victims are made aware of it. We are starting to see how badly historical CSE victims are faring within the system, and this will be no different to counter lines victims who have now overtaken all other forms of modern slavery, certainly in the child category. We are seeking a separate support pathway for the needs of UK victims, as currently their needs arising out of their exploitation remain grossly unmet, and therefore the prospect of them rebuilding their lives is an impossibility. You'll note that there isn't, in this agenda, there isn't a county lines male voice present. The sad fact is, we're not at a place where this can happen for numerous reasons. Those who became victims from 2010 onwards, the decade which saw the introduction of the CCE category, remain far from out of their exploitation. Minors are transitioning from exploited trafficked children to vulnerable adults, to alpha victims, and then to prisoners. So similar to survivors today, they won't be ready to recognise and acknowledge their exploitation for decades yet, let alone expose the horrors in the system that should have protected them, as you've just heard from Karen. Some of these victims' parents, however, are speaking for them, and it is by no means a coincidence that independent parents unknown to each other across the UK are echoing the exact same thing. So just very quickly, before I just flip through the slides, just to give you a bit of context on modern slavery, which child criminal exploitation falls under due to the trafficking. In 2019, there was 1,161 county lines referrals. That's 88% of those were minors. In the first 3 quarters of 2020, there was a 1,019 referrals, an increase. 91% of those were minors. We will soon be hopefully seeing the referrals for the whole of 2020 published soon. So these will be mainly British citizens within county lines, and we didn't view British people as trafficked or as modern slavery victims up to now. Those we heard about were usually those with special needs or disability, hence their being vulnerable to exploitation in the first place. So the language of modern slavery didn't exist as it now does, but what we're seeing is the police forces and local authorities still struggling with their statutory duty or resisting the notion of modern slavery itself amongst British children, let alone adults. And this situation becomes hugely problematic as they are the only 2 first responders for British exploitation victims, and their inaccurately understood gatekeeping to the modern slavery identification system is causing huge implications for victims and their families. A system that was designed to meet the needs of foreign victims. So it follows that the processes and support systems won't meet the needs of British victims. Very complex, as you've just heard. So I'm going to just flip through some of these slides just very quickly. Have I got time to do that?
Oh, yes. Yeah, very quickly.
Okay. Can I have the next one, please? So this, in essence, what you're seeing there is the problem. County lines victims are being seen as choosing a lifestyle choice. Next one, please. So this, in essence, is what's going on within county lines. British children and young people being rewired to carry out crime, be the front man for county lines activity, the shield behind which organised crime groups are hiding, low-hanging fruits, that's arrested, which makes no difference to the criminality whatsoever. Deliberately being positioned to develop drug addiction, to keep them running, to keep them in, deliberately, and then subjected to debt bondage, sexual exploitation, violence, humiliation, serious violent harm, threats, coercion, reprisals, if they stray away from the path put in place for them. Many of these young people are neurodivergent, commonly with ADHD, autism, Asperger's, which again, the vulnerability is obvious there. And I'm talking about a huge percentage there. There's a long line of new child participants waiting in the wings, ready, primed and rewired to step into the role of a runner who's taken out. Nobody's asking why this might be the case, but there is plenty of rhetoric about them having made a lifestyle choice. Bizarre conclusion given. No child wakes up one day independently choosing to be a drug dealer, part-time or as a career choice. So behind every child exploited into county lines, there's an adult if you look far back enough. Yes, children are recruiting and killing each other, but who taught them to? Who introduced them to the drugs and the weapons? Who told them where to go and how? Many of those involved now we're seeing had never strayed beyond their school and are suddenly traveling 200 miles alone and in darkness. How does that happen? Next one, please. So this is the elephant in the room, the grooming. Plenty of statutory safeguarding meetings, and there is no mention whatsoever of the rewiring and the grooming that's actually driving this phenomena. Next one, please. Just a very quick visual for you to show why county lines victims, especially children, are not engaging. All of those factors are playing into the no comment interviews and the wall of silence, basically. I don't think I need to add any more there. Next one, please. So very quick slide just to show a British victim's journey through the various systems and where they're being failed under each category there. And, you know, it starts from, we've got children who entered this at a very, very young age, and they are not out and they're in their 20s. So it's an ongoing scenario, and they are being failed by every authority that they trigger. And of course, if you look at the last block there, that's a modern slavery victim who's ending up in prison. There are miscarriages of justice. They're coming out, they're homeless, they're being re-trafficked, and the cycle continues. And of course, you know, the rhetoric is that exploitation suddenly stops on your 18th birthday and you should know better, you should step out of all this nonsense, and you should just say no to the exploiters now. But in real life, it just doesn't work that way. Next one, please. So there are 3 states within each victim, and that's the complication here, really. You've got the victim, you've got the alpha victim, who then goes on to, you know, recruit other children, for example, and then you've got a perpetrator. So all of those things can be happening at the same time to one person. Next one. Not going to read this out to you, but it's, you know, this is one of the key things that authorities are failing to grasp. You don't need to have crossed borders to be a modern slavery victim. You don't even need to have traveled from one county to another. In fact, you can be trafficked up the road from where you live for the purposes of exploitation. And that's just not being understood. And, you know, we're still hearing, even today, police officers telling families that the NRM and the modern slavery legislation is only for foreign victims. Now, this whole notion about going along willingly to whatever's happening is another reason why lots and lots of cases that we're seeing are being basically treated as if the children are complicit, because they appear to have gone along willingly. There's a lot of rhetoric about, well, you know, he knew what he was doing, and you know, that style of language, but actually it's all a waste of time, because it is an irrelevance. Children cannot consent to their own modern slavery, even if they're saying, yes, I want to do that, you know, show me how to do that. It's an irrelevance. And yet the reliance on those statements is absolutely horrific. Next one, please. That's what the NRM is supposed to do. And to be honest with you, it's fairly laughable in the context of County Lines victims. It is absolutely not happening. Absolutely not happening. Next one. Big problem within County Lines again. You can have a child, an under 18, who may be, you know, CCE, groomed with all the neurodivergent vulnerabilities, even a positive traffic decision, even a victim of serious violence, homeless, etc. It all becomes irrelevant at age 18. They're deemed to have mental capacity now. If they go missing, then they're choosing to do that. It's choosing, basically, and you're not a victim once you're 18, because you should know better. And what we're seeing is that this is an absolute win for organised crime groups, because all the services drop off at the age of 18. There's no transition. There's no recognition that a vulnerable child is now a vulnerable adult, and parents are basically isolated as the only safeguarding person involved in a particular case, and they're seen to be invading the child's privacy. Which is what the child wants authorities to think anyway, because he's under the control of the gangs. So it's a huge problem. Next one.
Space, I'm really sorry. We will have to just conclude in a minute, because we're well over time. I'm just conscious we've got other speakers.
No problem.
And I'm really sorry.
Do you want to end it there?
Yeah, if you wanted to wrap up that, that's
can
great.
I just have the last slide in that case, actually, Phil?
Thank you.
Next one, right at the end. That one, that's the one. The radical thinking. I'm just going to leave folks with a few things to think about. No, the one titled Radical Thinking, Radical Rethinking even. So just going to leave you with a few pointers on what we need to be doing. Law enforcement, local authorities as designated first responders are not in the best interest of British modern slavery victims. Charities and NGOs are far better placed to do this. There's mounting evidence of failure of the legislation and policies, yet we're about to see the NRM child decision-making devolvement to LA's proceeding as a pilot, which we are strongly opposed to. There is a real conflict of interest here because law enforcement, due to the fact that crime and offender focus is their main goal there, and local authorities due to thresholds and costs. I think we need to be responding with direct intervention and contextual safeguarding as opposed to diversion, which is what we're seeing, which is not appropriate, but appropriate for exploited victims because they don't have the choice to go for a diversion. It needs to be a spend to save initiative. We're losing too much time in a lost, in a trial and error response. Modern slavery victims blacklisted by financial institutions as a direct consequence of their exploitation should be assisted with reversals. Without a bank account, they can't get a job, they can't get a mortgage, they can't get a credit card, they can't move on. Victims should be channeled down a separate support package pathway, proactively assisted by local authorities into education and employment. I did have a slide which talked about that. And lastly, if a modern slavery system is to exist, it needs to be one that works for all victims equally, and currently it doesn't. British victims are being failed massively. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll leave it there.
Why have you given me £100?
Oh, thank you so much, Space. That was really, really powerful. And I'm sorry that we had to sort of cut you slightly short. Are you happy for us to share the slides? I can see some queries about that in the chat.
Yeah, that's fine.
Are you sure? Well, you can send us a version of them. That would be great.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
You're great. Thank you so much. So our next speaker is Emily. Emily is not only a survivor and anti-slavery activist, she's also a published author. Her book is out now. It's called Enslaved, and actually it's debuted at #6 in the Sunday Times paperback bestseller, which is amazing. Really incredible achievement. But really recommend everyone get her book Enslaved about some of her experiences. But really delighted to hear from her now. It's pre-recorded, so just gonna hopefully share my screen and this should all work. There we go.
I was trafficked from the age of 11 to 20, both from criminal and sexual exploitation. I was failed by the system and by those who could have intervened, including social services, the police, and by teachers. For example, I was found in a number of drug houses and paedophile houses by my youth worker, missing over 126 times from school, and it was never picked up on. I was also getting stoned with my youth worker and selling drugs to the police. In 2019, I was referred into the NRM by a first responder who didn't know how to do a referral and didn't have the confidence or training to include all of my story. The support that was provided was inadequate as there was no English-speaking workers available, so I was left without support for 3 months whilst being in the NRM. I contacted an NGO who managed to find me an NRM support worker over 200 miles away. I've never met my support worker and have never been able to build a trusting relationship with them. I've had to navigate and find my own way through the NRM without any help. When I joined the NRM, I was told I would not be entitled to legal help, counselling or face-to-face support, and it was only through an NGO, not my worker, that I managed to find legal help and a solicitor. The subpayments that were introduced in 2020 to British survivors are now taking survivors over the legal aid threshold, which is delaying survivors in trying to seek justice and compensation from the same people who failed them. The Home Office has set this up, but it is not working. All it is doing is adding re-trauma to survivors and making something that should be helping survivors recover is instead causing another traumatic experience. The NRM was not and has not been set up or designed to cater for British survivors' needs, and it needs to be changed.
Great, thank you so much. So Emily is here to take questions, by the way, at the end of the meeting as well. So, and thank you for your pre-recorded speech. Our next speaker is Anne-Marie Douglas from the Salvation Army. She'll be speaking about the NRM and British victims. Is it a good fit?
Thank you, Tamara. Okay, I will apologise in advance for any generalisation that I make if I run over time, and also for the fact that I'll probably cover a number of points that have already been made. Finally, I really want to apologise to Karen, who spoke earlier, because of the experience that she has had within the NRM. I would invite her to contact me personally should she wish to do so, just that because she's still in the NRM, so that we can see where things are at and what can be done to rectify the situation as it stands. So firstly, my view is that as far as the NRM goes, it should be victim first, nationality second. However, as the purpose of today is around British victims, I will focus my attention on that. From my perspective, I think we need to consider whether it's the case that the NRM is becoming or has become the default referral pathway for many British citizens who are targeted by perpetrators of modern slavery. Excuse me. Many have experienced long-term social disadvantage, often leading to unstable or chaotic lifestyles in a society where some of those who have a responsibility to help them often struggle themselves to understand the legislation or negotiate their way through misaligned processes. And I also do take Karen's point about the danger of labelling individuals in a particular way. And we definitely do accept and acknowledge that not all victims have come from chaotic backgrounds. They're not all, substance users or suffering from mental health. But I will be speaking from what we have experienced as prime contractor and at the front line when we receive referrals into the NRM, referrals of adult victims. So of the nationalities that we have supported in the victim care contract, British victims are still in the top 5, with numbers increasing month on month, and they do feature prominently as victims of criminal exploitation. It has been said that we have no male voice speaking today, but I just want to touch on some key points from a case study of a male victim who we did support within the NRM. And I will refer to him as Jay. And Jay started taking recreational drugs at a very young age, eventually becoming addicted to heroin and crack cocaine. His situation spiraled to the extent that he was in and out of prison, eventually losing his job, and because his family were unable to cope with the strain that this was putting on them, he left home and lived on the streets for a long period of time before he was eventually targeted by traffickers who started providing him with drugs. And Jay reckons that because he was so trusting and because they seemed to be friends, he quickly began to rely on them. They gave him more and more drugs until they started demanding money and then expecting him to pay this money back by dealing for them. Eventually, they tried to get him to take drugs from other dealers. His life was in danger. He ran away. They found him. He tried to go back home. They found where he lived. Eventually ran away again and decided he had to go to the police. That was the first time that Jay knew there was something called modern slavery. That was the first time he knew that there was something called the NRM. Jay's circumstances really do mirror the typology of British victims that we encounter at the point of referral into the NRM. Many are exploited by way of county lines or cuckooing. Many are care leavers, either in the recent past or years before. Many have complex histories involving poverty, abuse, drug use, or homelessness, or all of those. In many cases, there is evidence that their exploitation started whilst they were in care, but there's little or no continuity of support for child victims once they get to age 18, and we often find that their situations spiral into adulthood. It's really important that agencies and first responders who work with British victims identify from the outset their particular needs and not assume that the NRM is the answer for every situation, because it isn't. Our experience has shown that British victims in the NRM can often be more discontent in safe house accommodation than they are receiving outreach support, for example. This can lead to disruptive behaviour and requests for the service user to be transferred around the service to different safe houses, which is rarely the solution for the issues they present. However, like Jay, for some, a safe house can provide the security, consistency and structure that they need to reflect and recover. British or not, every survivor is different, and so the decisions taken must be needs-led and should not be taken for convenience, which too often can appear to be the case. Of course, the NRM can provide a wealth of practical support. It can assist in terms of reinstating benefits, sorting out bank accounts, providing assistance to find work, to re-engage with substance misuse treatment services, for example. But is the NRM a good fit, or does it only touch the surface as far as British victims are concerned? Yes, it's more accessible, but many of the needs of British victims should be met by statutory services in local communities as they have entitlements. However, as with other nationalities, many British victims do not realise that they are victims of modern slavery, and so their exploitation is often not identified, reported or responded to as such. We have found that even where services are involved, for example, social services, this is no guarantee that these cases will be managed as one of modern slavery, as there are often many other factors at play in each individual case. Once referred into the NRM, experience has shown that many social workers step back from a case, and there then ensues a real battle to get them to re-engage and to exercise their duty of care. Under the new victim care contract, the Salvation Army has created a role of partnership manager to manage an engagement strategy, and as part of this we'll be working with our subcontractors to ensure that in all the areas where we are working with victims, there is the level of engagement necessary with the key stakeholders who have a role to play in providing wraparound support for all victims, British as well as all others. There are so many factors involved in each particular case, but I'd just like to spend the little time that I've been allocated looking at the NRM and the impact it can have on the accommodation needs of British victims. Because the fact of the matter is, where a British victim is referred into the NRM, often they are moved from where they live, and often this can cause them to lose their homes and all of their belongings. Despite having entitlement to local authority accommodation and housing benefit, due to the high number of danger areas around the country where British victims tend to be exploited, many are left with no option but to enter safe house accommodation a significant distance away from where they live and may already be receiving the services that they are reliant on. This is because at the point of rescue or escape, they are still usually at risk from their exploiters. The priority of the first responder, often the police in these cases, is to move the potential victim into the NRM and away from the local area. The police often do not have the facilities, capability, or willingness to engage with other stakeholders involved in the case, for example, social services or local authorities, and so can put extreme pressure on the referrals team to hastily place a potential victim into a safe house. First responders really need to understand more about the background of each particular victim and their entitlements prior to making a referral for immediate accommodation in the NRM. They also need to ensure that the potential victim is provided with sufficient information about the NRM and the implications of entering prior to gaining their consent to refer. So is there a possible way forward as far as accommodation needs are concerned? A British victim referred into the NRM and relocated to a safe house in a different local authority area should really be exempt from the local connection test for housing purposes, and should also be deemed as having a priority need by nature of their being a potential victim of modern slavery. They should have the immediate right to make housing application in the new area and not be caught up in a standoff between local authorities disagreeing on who should take responsibility. In terms of priority need, once the Domestic Abuse Bill is passed, a new category of a person who is homeless as a result of that person being a victim of domestic abuse will be added. However, there is no specific mention of victims of modern slavery. There is another category, a person who is vulnerable as a result of old age, mental illness or handicap or physical disability or other special reason. However, I don't know how this is defined in the Act, or if there is relevant case law that might help us when advocating on behalf of British victims. The Housing Act also refers to special circumstances, but what we need the legislation to do is to specifically mention victims of modern slavery so that their rights and entitlements are not left open to interpretation. The new local authority dealing with the area in which a British victim is being supported should be obligated to handle their housing need, should be obligated to put together their personal housing plan, and if necessary, liaise with the previous local authority of the area where they've been moved from. And efforts should be made, if it is safe to do so, to ensure that the potential victim can be rehoused or returned to their former home. If it's not safe to do so, then the new local authority should have a duty to act without, as I say, resorting to the local connection test. I feel that in many cases the emphasis should be placed on seeking to resettle British victims in local communities as quickly as possible, so that the services that exist to provide them with the various forms of support they may need can play a role in doing so, because the NRM does not provide all of the answers. And often when support workers are seeking to engage with relevant services, there are waiting lists, or those services have other priorities, and each day a victim is in support, the clock is ticking. British victims should, throughout their period in the NRM, and irrespective of where they are living, remain entitled to outreach support so that support workers can coordinate all of their needs related to their exploitation. That is what the NRM was set up to do. There has been mention made about the lack of criminal investigation, the lack of compensation, and those should really feature quite prominently in the work that we do with British victims. I feel for British victims it would be far more empowering and less disruptive to have a system in place that ensures that they can return to the community and have access to the various forms of support that they need when they need it for the length of time that they need it. Although there's been much discourse over the years about the role of local authorities in supporting the needs of victims, and I do acknowledge that progress has been made in many areas due to local collaboration, despite the Modern Slavery Act, we're really still not at a place where the responsible local authorities is accurate or consistent. So this disparity really needs to be addressed centrally and through unambiguous legislation by which local authorities can be held accountable and their response to victims of modern slavery monitored more closely. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anne-Marie. I think that's some really interesting ideas about what the challenges and what needs to be done. So thank you for that. We now move on. We're meant to have the Home Office, as I mentioned. Unfortunately, the new head of Modern Slavery Unit can't be with us today. We do have someone else from the Home Office who's going to take back any questions. And I think maybe just at this point, I'd like to say that perhaps with the Home Office, while they're here, agree to perhaps meet with the survivors who've spoken today, perhaps also with the Salvation Army, so we can actually maybe have a sort of a small round table with the survivors in the Home Office. I don't know if there's anyone from the Home Office who can kind of nod or say yes.
Hi, Tamara. Sorry, it's Luke here. Thanks very much, and very happy to take questions later. And again, apologies that Damien, the head of the Modern Slavery Unit, wasn't able to join today. Tamara, very happy to pick that up with you separately. I think that sounds like a great idea.
Great. Okay. And so our next speaker is Sarah. Sarah was a client of Snowdrop. She is another survivor voice, and she's going to talk about the impact and challenges she's faced.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. Hi everyone, my name's Sarah. That's actually not my real name, but I need to obviously protect my identity. I'm a British survivor of trafficking, CSE, and sex trafficking. I first met my traffickers when I was 10, and it wasn't until just before I was 20 that I was then rescued. I'm really lucky that I did get to be supported by the Snowdrop Project, because they offer long-term support, which is so vital. It actually shocks me that it's still not available for every survivor, because it definitely really needs to be. Before I did have Snowdrop, I had been in a few different accommodations that are supposed to be there to support people like me. A lot of the cases with those places were that support staff hadn't had the actual adequate trauma-enforced training, therefore it ended up being quite detrimental. There was a huge gap between housing a survivor to then actually supporting and helping us to begin our lives again. As we all know, like going through trafficking, coming out the other side of it presents a huge number of obstacles and difficulties. Just a few, isolation, potential mental health, physical problems, housing, and even just being able to speak and advocate for yourself. These will all be there regardless of who you are and where you come from. You're not immune from trafficking because you're British, so therefore you're not immune from the impact that then has. Yet there still seems to be a very different approach to us throughout the recovery and the support process. There is still a huge stigma that it doesn't happen to us, or our cases are not on the same level as non-British survivors. We're all very aware that that is not the case. I feel from my own experiences and from others around me that I've known that as a British survivor, you really have to fight to be seen, believed and accepted. This is incredibly dangerous, as it hugely risks British victims from actually coming forward. I know, looking back, if I'd known all the things that I've known through the last years of being rescued, I probably wouldn't have come forward myself. This isn't just with the public, but this is also workers and professionals in the field also, which is alarming. The way we are supported can also be very different, often creating more challenges for us that can be unnecessary, because obviously we speak the language, we know this country, we have an understanding of how our communities and our services work. We can often be expected to navigate a big portion of our support ourselves. We're expected to manage our struggles better and manage easier by ourselves than if you are a non-British survivor. When a support service timeframe ends, we are less likely to be signposted to other support services, or we tend to be left to find our own support as and when we feel it's needed. Even though we all have the same struggles to the trauma that we have all had, this is not right, and it does need to change. While I was trafficked as a child, I was failed numerous times by foster carers, social workers, schools, etc. Probably mainly because I am British. They wouldn't have seen it, they wouldn't have expected it, they wouldn't have known what to do, where to look. We then now face the risk of being failed more post-rescue for those same reasons. I do feel there should be a lot more advocacy for us, because we are often forgotten about. The system that we have to be a part of in order to be safe and have a chance to live a normal life again needs to be modified so that it is a safe and fully supportive procedure for all survivors, so that more people feel like they're able to come forward and can all be properly supported to overcome those issues they can't do alone, and they shouldn't be expected to. From my own experiences, I often see that we as British survivors fall into wrong categories. If we speak out about what's wrong in the system, we can be labelled as troublemakers or ungrateful for the support. But if we stay quiet, we're either then forgotten or dismissed. Most of the sector for support is faith-based, and while that is great, that can also present its own harmful challenges. So there needs to be a healthy balance. I still see now non-British survivors who are rescued at the same time as me in the same safe houses as me that will still be helped and are in touch with those professionals. But you could honestly say my name to those professionals and they would not even know who I am. So where do we actually now go from here? As a whole, as a country and as professionals, we have done an amazing job in improving and identifying victims and public and professional awareness. But there is, I feel, still a long way to go, especially in terms of British survivors. I think we really need to look into creating a safe space for us to advocate and share those experiences, so that then as a whole we can find ways to move forward. I also feel that there could potentially be the help of training of professionals specifically around British survivors and the issues that we face as British people. Again, I am extremely fortunate that I did have long-term support with Snowdrop. Honestly, I would not be here today if I hadn't had that. I exited their support a long time ago, but then I found myself last year having to be in need of them again for a few months to help with housing and other issues. And they were straight there and willing to be there when I needed them again. And I know that if in the future there is that chance that if I needed them again, I would be able to go to them and they would help me. But this is because they understand the bigger long-term picture, and that's something that needs to be blanketed, I think, across the entire sector. Throughout the last few years of being rescued, I have been labelled many times, as we've already heard from other survivors and professionals today. I've been labelled a liar, an exaggerator. I've been used as the term prostitute, that I've asked for it, that it was my fault, that I learnt the term trafficking to use to cover up my own promiscuity. These shockingly actually have come from the professionals in the last 7 years of being rescued. And that is because I am British. I'm still now facing a mountain of issues. There hasn't actually been a year yet that I've not had to have operations to fix the damage that was done. The majority that me and British survivors have is that we have to do a lot of these by ourselves. And it seems that the mental impact of these things isn't still now identified or classed as a support need, even though it is very crucial. I often feel that being articulate and British is sometimes my biggest downfall, which shouldn't be the case. In the last 7 years, I've had to move 10 times, most cases having absolutely no idea where I'm moving to or for how long. I have then ended up feeling like a huge burden on our systems from a country that failed to protect me as a child from exploitation. None of my traffickers have been prosecuted at a time when my case was open and we were working towards prosecution. One of my main traffickers died, and our justice system deemed that as a reason to close the case because, I quote, "He is no longer here to defend himself." That is shocking. I've never also received compensation. So where do we really begin to go to fix this for British survivors? Because it seems from my point looking that it is broken from day dot. before we are even rescued, but starting mostly from the safe house. So where does it end? Where do we fix it? And where do we get to a point where British survivors truly get seen as survivors of modern slavery? Thank you very much.
Gosh, thank you so much, Sarah. That was incredibly powerful, but shocking. It's shocking that even in the last few years, you're still being labelled in this way, and that there's been zero justice, zero compensation. It just shows how many parts of the system are broken, unfortunately, and how many things need to be fixed. And not a lot of survivors don't have Snowdrop supporting them, and even with that support, there are all these challenges. And now we have, in fact, Laura, who is the CEO and founder of Snowdrop, who's going to be speaking. And they've also done a lot of work supporting British survivors. So really looking forward to hear from Laura. Thanks.
Tamara, and thanks everybody. Sarah, thank you so much for talking before me, and thank you to Karen and Emily as well for sharing before Sarah did. I will try and keep it short because I'm aware of time. I do want to honour people's chance to ask questions, and I feel like I'm mainly summarising a lot of what has already been said. As has been introduced, we're an organisation called the Snowdrop Project. We provide long-term support after the NRM has finished. We provide this through social work, through therapy, through community activities, and through a house renovation programme. We don't have an end date, it's based on the person's needs. Our average support time is around about 18 months, but it can be anything to 4 to 5 years. I'll briefly talk about a few of the things that we see in terms of the challenges towards British survivors. I will caveat that to say, I think there's been some comments in the chat about the fact that there are also challenges to people from other countries. And that isn't to say that there isn't, it's just that because of the focus of this forum, I will just be focusing on some of the specifics that we see in terms of British survivors. So one of the things, I did have some slides to share, but because of time, I'm literally just going to kind of read briefly off it, but I can share them if people are interested. So in terms of the challenges, I think Sarah already mentioned it, and we have come a long way in terms of professional understanding of the fact that British people are targeted and are trafficked, but I think we still have a huge amount still to go. We experience quite a lot of misconception around trafficking of British people, often again considered that it couldn't really be that bad, that it doesn't really happen. And that then we face challenges around particularly things like looking at priority housing, which I think Anne-Marie also mentioned. And that is a real struggle sometimes to convince the housing professionals that they are should be considered as priority, because as a British person, they can, as Sarah said, express themselves clearly, they may understand bits of the system, and so is not considered as vulnerable as. And I do think that's an issue within the system that we have. So I think one of the things that I will say is, as I mentioned some of the challenges, I will give comments or ideas about things that I think might help, but they are just my point of view, they are just my ideas, and I think it's great to kind of have an open discussion around ways that we can bring things forwards. So again, from that perspective, I just think basically training is one of the areas that we really need to keep moving forwards, is making sure that that voice is there. And I think the really encouraging space that we're in now of bringing survivor voices into that forum, so actually we can hear what it's like from people's perspective, and not just be professionals telling other professionals what it's like. So I'm encouraged by this forum, and I think we can see more of that happening as we go ahead. Another thing that's been mentioned multiple times is looking at appropriate pathways. So although we work in a post-NRM situation, we get a lot of phone calls for advice for anything that lies outside of the NRM. And particularly over the last year, we've received a lot of phone calls from professionals who believe that it is appropriate for a British person to go into a safe house. And that is usually for reasons of safety in the connections with the local area. And their experience is kind of as everybody's described, both as Sarah's described and Maria's talked about, is that there is a battle backwards and forwards because the guidance isn't clear. And there is, as again Anne-Marie said, kind of ambiguous legislation, and it ends up being finger pointing between professionals of, well, it's your duty to take them, no, it's your duty to take them, no, it's your duty to take them. And actually at the centre of that is a very vulnerable person who needs safeguarding. And I think one of the things that we could look at for that appropriate pathway is clearer legislation, but also looking at shared and better understanding of needs and risk assessments. I think one of the things that's clear from this forum is that every single person is different. And often I think one of the challenges is that we just see people as victims of trafficking without actually considering all of the unique things that make that person them. And I think one of the improvements could be that we still see, from my opinion, the NRM local authorities working often in silo within their own legislation, within their own guidance, and potentially looking with the partnership development about shared needs assessment, shared understanding, shared risk assessments. So actually we are singing from the same hymn sheet of understanding rather than just finger pointing. The other thing in terms of appropriate pathways is that we have experienced, again, kind of post-NRM situations where people have had to remain within the area, or they've not been moved far enough away from the area that they were trafficked, and then have been identified by punters, or have been identified even by people who've been involved within the trafficking situation. There are then very few systems in place in order to work out how to move that person to a place of security or safety, because you've got the issue of local connection and how we then adjust that. There are systems in place around domestic violence, but at the moment there aren't those systems in place to actually look at, well, if somebody has been identified by somebody who recognises them from their trafficking, what do we do? How do we respond? How do we respond quickly? How do we communicate with that person and actually talk to them about what do they need in the middle of this situation? So I think, like I said, there's a lot of work to be done around appropriate pathways, whereas if the person was from a non-EU background and say we're in asylum seeker accommodation, we found it actually easier at that point to say, please could we move them to different asylum accommodation because of these reasons, and then there are those things in place without a local connection difficulty. Sorry, I am speaking fast just because of time. Bear with me. So another thing that's been mentioned is entitlement, and I think Karen really brought that home in the kind of experiences that she shared. And Karen, I would just mention, from a service that provides post-NRM support, you're absolutely not alone in the experiences that you faced. We have seen that with kind of multiple people that have come to us as British survivors in a post-NRM context. And so I am really sorry that, again, you have also experienced the same thing. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned, and it seems like a small thing, but actually we've seen it impact quite a few people that we've supported. So British survivors who have been trafficked to other countries and then come back to this country. There is entitlement and recourse to public funds, but what we have found is that there isn't an entitlement to PIP, which is specific for people who have difficulties related to their mental or physical health. And part of the reason is because they haven't been in the country for long enough, even though they're a UK citizen. If you're a refugee, you've got a loophole. If you're actually a victim of domestic violence, there is a loophole written in place for you. But if you are a British citizen who's been outside of the country and then returned to the country, there isn't a loophole in terms of accessing PIP support. And one of the easiest solutions I would suggest to that is creating a loophole for people who have that positive CG decision to say you can access PIP because of the fact that you've got that positive CG decision. And sometimes it's simple things like that within legislation that we can change. And as the last thing, which I'm sure a lot of people will have probably heard me talk about, which is around understanding how we meet the needs of people who are within the NRM or people who have been survivors of trafficking. I think there's a lot of discourse that often happens around the fact that needs are analysed from the specific perspective of needs that are attached to trafficking. But the problem is there are so many needs that are interrelated, and if we don't tackle those needs, then actually the person, as Karen mentioned, if she's exited at this point, her needs won't have been met. And actually we experience a lot of that with people who exit the NRM, that their needs haven't been met, and there are many, many long-term and ongoing issues that they need support with. And I think part of what would be useful is a discourse and an understanding of actually what do long-term needs look like? What does long-term recovery look like? And how can we better shape our support systems in order to be able to find those solutions? That's a very quick rundown. I was trying to cut it short.
Great, thank you. That was really so many useful recommendations there. I don't know, I hope the Home Office and others were noting all those down, because there's some of them are quite simple solutions that could have a radical difference. So now we have our very last speaker. Our earlier speakers, Karen mentioned Professor Susan Edwards' report from the early 90s, and we're very lucky to have Professor Susan Edwards herself to finally speak today.
Yes, hello, and thank you very much to everybody, and it's nice to meet you, Karen. high, especially at last. I'm not going to say much in terms of the NRM. In fact, I'm not going to say anything because all of you, most of you, in fact, have covered the problems and the limitations. So I'm just going to concentrate on one theme, but I will take you through the slides. I won't be talking about them, they'll be available for you. So I'm going to move on to my first slide if it's working. Probably is working. There we go. I think, I don't know whether you can see the cursor moving along here. Perhaps I should just say a bit about me and why am I here? Well, I think I'm here probably as an independent witness to validate the indomitable strength of Karen especially, and her seeking me out and seeking this rather obscure report, which I typed on I think it was called a Corona manual mechanical typewriter back in the 1990s. But it did cover my work that I did with the Safer Cities funding in Wolverhampton, and was the second of another report that I'd done for Nuffield in London on prostitution. So when I talk about loitering, soliciting women and young girls, the disproportionate prosecutions, I'm really coming from past to present, and I will quickly come to the present. I wanted to say something on the changing landscape from blame, but we've heard already today that in fact there still is a lot of blame and there still isn't enough recognition of exploitation. But of course, there was a lot of work being done in 1991, of which I was a part with the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. We've had the Sexual Offences Act, and people have talked about that. We've had Palermo, we've had the Modern Slavery Act. But the main point here is the continued labelling and stigma. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is a very important slide, I think, because what we're facing today with a case that's already in the High Court, I don't know whether we've had a decision on it, and this is really my key and main point, is that women and young girls who were proceeded against for loitering and soliciting offences way back then have the burden of the police national computers still having their records. So as Karen pointed out, their lives have been totally blighted, not only in terms of employment, but reputation and stigma. Anyway, what is so stunning, I think, in some of the cases that have been brought, there have been two cases by Broadfoot. Forgive me, I've forgotten her first name for this moment, but they are around trying to ensure that the police national computer will expunge these records instead of keeping them on there for 100 years, which is the practice. And the fact is that back in 1989, 10,490 women were prosecuted, women and young girls. This was just before the 1989 Children Act, so it was women, 17-year-olds as well, were prosecuted for loitering and soliciting. Many of those who were unable to pay the fine, of course, went to prison. And many of those had a number of convictions, and this is the problem. But there's that rather rough chart. And the whole question, one of the questions that have been put in the recent cases that I've just referred to, have been whether the very existence of the Street Offences Act Section 1, which penalised women in the main, are discriminatory. The courts have come to the conclusions that actually that act was not discriminatory. But let me move on quickly. Probably you can just about see here, what were the allied offences? Well, of course, they were called procuration, living off immoral earnings, but what they were the pimps who controlled, who exploited. Of course, this wasn't the language back then, but anyway, there were 1,000, I can hardly see that either, there were about 1,000 cases that were prosecuted. And I always, in my writings, I always said, well, wait a minute, that means that if 10,000 women were prosecuted and young girls, and there were 1,000 men who were prosecuted, and I'm referring here actually to curb crawling. The curb crawlers, that was the legislation that came in 1985. If 1,000 were prosecuted, well, 9,000 women are waiting all day for a, what was called then a trick. Well, it doesn't make sense. I mean, you'd expect at least 3 times or perhaps 10 times the number of curb crawlers that should be prosecuted. But anyway, the legislation was unfair. the rules of evidence for the legislation was unfair. Women and young girls only had to have a caution. The police saw them. They were then brought to court. They were called common prostitutes. There was no other offence in the whole, apart from the 19th century, when we talked about vagrancy offences, you being a common vagrant. There was nothing, but the common prostitute came before court and it was read out. You, Miss Edwards, being a common prostitute, what do you plead? So, of course, women and young girls pled guilty. Now, I said I wouldn't be very long on this, but anyway, let me get through. But there were, of course, people that were writing who were largely ignored. I wrote something called Protecting the the Honour of Innocent Men. The attempt there was to have a look at the curb calling legislation. There were changing international landscapes. I'll be very quick. Kathleen Barry wrote, shall I find the book? I think it's behind me if anybody can see. No, you can't. The Prostitution of Sexuality, and she was the founder of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. You'll have all this, and this is from her book, how it was set up, the original setting up of the coalition. So where am I with these slides? Let me get to the next. We're on that one. The next one, this is a wonderful picture. Here is Kathleen Barry. I don't know whether you can see that. Jan Raymond, who until recently has been the director. Now Aurora Javati de Deos, the director there, and of course Andrea Dworkin. This was the first meeting when we looked at the convention and we set out to change that convention at the Penn State, which was the first meeting. So there was work being done then. I just mentioned here some of the landmarks, and of course Palermo's been mentioned, and I mention it again then, so I won't go over that. I'll just draw your attention to anything that's new. So a bit more on Palermo, a bit more on Palermo protections. I mean, we've heard that we're not actually applying Palermo in the way that we should be. We've heard that. We've also heard that, of course, trafficking within the UK, which was one of the provisions of the Sexual Offences Act, is not trafficking of British, English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh women within and girls within the UK have not been seen in the same way as those trafficked from outside to inside. And of course, the whole notion of grooming, cyber grooming, gangs, entrapment, this has been all a recent relative awareness. We've also heard about the question of asylum, and that's a problem. And we've also heard, of course, about the NRM and the state measures set up in 2009 and how they're failing. We've heard from one of our speakers, especially, I think that was Space, about the recent data. There's a bit of data I put in here, which is really quite old. We must congratulate Duncan Lewis solicitors, and there's many others, I think, for the work that they and many others have done. So let's get back to the point, what I call the Broadford case and the stigma for life, which is what Karen has talked so eloquently about, and her indomitable courage to continue with fighting for this and for others, and also, of course, Sarah. But there is a stigma for life, and this is something that we must, and we are all fighting to do something about. And all credit as well to Harriet Wistrich and her team for taking this to the court. Now, I don't know whether there's a decision today or whether we've had a decision. I haven't seen or heard of a decision. We're not entirely satisfied with the way in which the courts have actually responded to some of the grounds. But the essential thing is that we want to see a review of, and it's at the bottom of the slide, of the retention policy in respect of the police being allowed to retain, this is the multiple conviction rule, retain the previous convictions going back to 1980, which is why Karen spoke about my report, such as it is, because it said to her, everything that you have said is true. I didn't know about Karen. I spent time with the police force in Wolverhampton, going around with the police force and talking with young girls and women. And I wrote it up in a report for Safer Cities. I had no idea that it would serve as an independent witness testimony of everything that she has said. So you might want to look at Julie Bindle's recent article in The Spectator. You can get it online. Let's end the criminal record trap for sex trade survivors. I say a little bit about that. what's to be done? You've all said much more eloquently about what is to be done about this. And I can't add to that. I would simply add that certainly the COVID recognition, which of course we've had a lot of talk, and one of the speakers mentioned about the domestic abuse bill and the way in which the domestic abuse bill is not accommodating issues of homelessness and other issues that affect trafficking victims. But again, if we look at domestic abuse, a lot's been said about COVID and domestic abuse and how that has been heightened and how deaths have increased as a result of women being trapped in domestic abuse. There's not enough being said about the way in which those trapped in slavery and trafficking situations are even further trapped during COVID, and the way in which the internet now is being used by traffickers even more, by groomers even more, and women and young girls are even less protected. So finally, I've probably had my 10 minutes anyway. What has been clear to me, having written about sexual exploitation in many ways as an academic, have gone out as a researcher in the field since the 1980s, has been absolutely clear that it's part of a wider context and structure. It's part of the context and structure that people like Catherine Barry, Andrea Dworkin have talked about then. It's a wider structure of sexualization. And, you know, if we live in a world that the French Connection UK has a T-shirt, and you can see that on the slide, and Abercrombie's talks about push-up bras for kids, where actually women and young girls especially are exploited by that industry and seen to define themselves as sexual objects. As Andrea Dworkin said so much better, you know, those who go into soft porn are told you're glamorous, you're wonderful, you're a great kid, you're doing wonderfully. That actually the whole notion of how women's sexuality is reinforced through its sexualization, and we have to blame the entertainment industry, the way they use this commodity. And, you know, let's name it 50 Shades of Grey and all the rest of it. It's part of this wider context. So I'll end now. 1 minute. I'm absolutely ending now. And thank you very much. It's been really fascinating and interesting, and I'd be happy to be part of this once again and get involved with all that you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. So everyone, thank you so much. we have run out of time for questions, and I appreciate in the world of Zoom, everyone usually has to run off for yet another meeting. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to all our speakers, particularly from those that have taken the time to explain the situations they found themselves in and found courage to share that. Is absolutely invaluable, and certainly from my experience being around this world, it just doesn't happen enough. So thank you very much for your time. What I will do is I will take questions away. I will ask for answers, and once we've got those, we'll publish them on our Human Trafficking Foundation website. I think that's it, Tamara.
Yes, and yeah, just another thank you just again to particularly to our survivor speakers, Sarah, Emily and Kim. I can see also in the chat that Tatiana suggested we make a report of some of the recommendations, so that's something we will look into. It's a really interesting idea, thank you. And yeah, and also the chat's really interesting, so we'll try and save some of that and maybe put that as well alongside all the questions that Phil's got together, and we'll try and get answers from the speakers if the speakers are happy to do that. And then we can end vaguely on time right now. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for your input.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.